Welcome, Mr. Dawbin and Ms. McNair. How are you?
Well,
Very well, thank you.
Would each of you, maybe starting with you, Mr. Dawbin, please care to give us your full name, title, and either declare an oath or a declaration?
Certainly. My name is Bruce Matthews Dawbin.
Would you talk a little closer to the mic, please? Thank you. Or we just pull it towards you.
Yeah. I'm representing Australia ICOMOS, the International Council for Monuments and Sites. I'm a member of the National Committee of that organisation and have the role of State Representative at the present time. So the affirmation, I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. McNair?
yes, good afternoon. I'm Cherie McNair. I'm representing the International Council of Museums Australia chapter, for which I'm the National Secretary, and apologies from our Chair, Dr. Matt Trinker, who's unable to join you today. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Would you like to make a short opening statement, Mr. Dawbin or Ms. McNair, or both?
I have one. Do you want to start? Or? Okay. So ICOM Australia acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia on which our museums, galleries and sites stand. ICOM Australia thanks Parliament of New South Wales and this committee for the opportunity to speak today. ICOM is a membership association, a non-governmental organisation which establishes professional and ethical standards for museums and activities. As a forum of experts, it makes recommendations on issues related to cultural heritage, promotes capacity building and advances knowledge. ICOM is the voice of museum professionals on the international stage and raises public cultural awareness through global networks and cooperation programs. The Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences is a member of the International Council of Museums, as are 850 Australian museums and professionals, part of the 44,686 professionals in over 138 countries around the world. ICOM is the only global museum organisation, and all of us are guided by a code of ethics. The ICOM Code of Ethics for Museums establishes the values and principles shared by ICOM and the international museum community. It sets minimum standards of professional practice and performance for museums and their staff. ICOM regards the development, documentation, preservation and representation of heritage collections as being a common good at the heart of civil society. We proceed from the view that the people own museum collections and have knowledge about those collections. The ICOM Australia membership has an expectation that the movable heritage is housed in a safe location and that there are adequate resources and intent to protect and preserve built heritage. ICOM Australia is concerned that 2 heritage sites will be impacted by the design for the Powerhouse Museum, namely Willow Grove and St George's Terrace, both of which are planned for demolition. These are considered of significant heritage value by the local community. The establishment of any new museum is a unique opportunity to take account of the fundamental obligation to protect and preserve public collections in perpetuity. Concern has been raised regarding the site presently favoured by government and its propensity for flooding. ICOM Australia believes this concern should be addressed in any preparation and planning by reference to the guiding principles enshrined in ICOM's Code of Ethics. Investment in museum development is critical, and the New South Wales State Government's contributions in this area have been well received by ICOM members. The membership is open to and would welcome opportunities to assist with review and planning with consideration to the Code of Ethics and the best practice it describes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dawbin?
Australia ICOMOS welcomes the announcement by the Premier on the 4th of July that the New South Wales Government has reconsidered its proposal to relocate the Powerhouse Museum from Multimo to Parramatta. ICOMOS has continued to monitor the detailed implications of this announcement and remains concerned that the form of the upgraded Ultimo Museum or the scope of the Parramatta facility have either not been resolved or threaten to impact on heritage items at both locations. The heritage values of the Ultimo site is one of the major issues that we're following very closely. Particularly in recent times, there was a listing, a State Heritage Register listing of the Ultimo Tramway Powerhouse in isolation from the rest of the complex. ICOMOS supports a full and detailed assessment of the heritage values of the entire site and upgrading the listing nomination to include the entire Powerhouse Museum site. We believe it has heritage values ranging from social, aesthetic, scientific and historical values as an entire complex, and they're of exceptional level and worthy of long overdue recognition as a heritage site of state significance. Another issue of concern is the protection of the collection and its appropriate display. The priceless collection includes many large items, including a 1785 Baldwin Watt beam engine and an 1835 Maudslay beam engine, which are unique in this country and in the world and are still in operating condition. The Steam Revolution Gallery is unique in Australia and exceptional in global terms as a tangible narrative of the Industrial Revolution. Any breaking up of the collection of the Steam Revolution or the beam engine and the transport hall would be quite unacceptable to have that dislocated and relocated in any form. The future upgraded museum at Ultimo should not lose sight of its origins and original purpose as a science and technology museum first and foremost. The matter of the Parramatta River site, the concept of a purpose-designed cultural and arts facility in Parramatta is applauded, and this may include technological exhibits for Western Sydney, as is widely been indicated in the media reports. The majority of the Powerhouse Museum's collection is still warehoused at Castle Hill, much of which has never been accessible to the public. And expansion to new locations for the museum should have been part of a long-term planning for the Powerhouse Museum, but has not occurred. The selection of the current site is incomprehensible. It's inadequate in area, it's flood prone, doesn't have major transport links, and as far as we're aware, there's minimal investigation into alternative sites. The Cumberland Hospital complex is one such site that should be investigated further, in our opinion. The other negative aspect of the site selection is the demolition of the two existing heritage items, Willow Grove and St George's Terrace. We're also concerned about the consultation process. This has been widely publicised by other groups such as the Powerhouse Museum Alliance, but from our own experience through this entire process, which has been quite active for the consultation process quite late in the day from 2018, ICOMOS has not been consulted at any stage of that process, and as the cultural heritage organisation in the country, in this country, one would expect that we would have some level of involvement. And the relocation to Parramatta was announced as a foregone conclusion before that consultation process was wrapped up and announced. So, acceptance of a design which is not a museum, we have to decisions regarding the proposal to relocate the museum and the selection of site need to be addressed, and then the acceptance of a design which is not a museum facility will not accommodate the most important exhibits, and also the negative collateral damage of the demolition of 2 heritage buildings. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the for those opening comments. I'll throw it to the committee now. Probably go to the opposition first.
Thank you, Mr. Shoebridge. Ms. McNair, you mentioned your 2 concerns were the Willow Grove in St. George's Terrace, and then the flooding concerns. What is your sorry, sorry, I had a scratch.
Right.
Yes, I'm fine.
Been concerned there for a moment, Walt.
You thought. No, it's fine. So, what is your concern about the flooding? And have you seen the design of? It is on stilts, a milk crate on stilts. So, what is your view on the government's attempt to overcome the flooding concerns?
So in terms of the first part of your question, the ICOM membership doesn't believe in one history, be that built, object-based or oral histories should be replacing another. So the demolition of historical sites of importance is something that we don't advocate for as a membership. We don't see a new history overtaking another. We like to see these things coexisting. That's part of the reason we're all in museums. On the secondary part of your question in relation to flooding, and I or the ICOM committee haven't been privy to the detailed plans for the site. We've seen the concept drawings from Moreau Consinori, like a majority of other people. The issue that we have as a membership-based organisation is there's an expectation that museums provide for the safe care of collections, and whether that's their own collections or collections on loan from other institutions or from individuals in the community. And obviously with any facility that's subject to flooding, then that brings that safety into question. So the safety and preservation. And as we've seen most recently with the bushfires, any kind of potential natural disaster can be pre-planned for, and most museums within our membership have disaster planning as a significant component of their activity. But it shouldn't necessarily be something that you are proactively planning for a natural disaster, if that makes sense. Like, you wouldn't necessarily pick a flood-prone site if you're having to include that. It tends to be something that you're addressing, as a last resort if disaster strikes, rather than something that you're planning for in the build site.
Now, is there any way to? Do you see any way of preserving Willow Grove and St. George's Terrace and still undertaking the construction of the new museum?
That's a difficult question. It's not something that so noting that I represent a large body of members, that's not something that we have gone back to consult them. In terms of the design, certainly there are other institutions around the world that have a combination of contemporary and historical architecture. The most local would be the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, for example. They have a heritage building within the centre of their courtyard. And another example in Tasmania, you've got a Harry Seidler building on top of Mona that's been maintained. So, I mean, there are other examples where there is a combination of historical and contemporary architecture coexisting. So it is possible. That is possibly a question for the architect.
Well, you don't have to go that far. You can go to Phillip Street, where
Yes,
there was
absolutely.
that large development and the retention of that run of gorgeous colonial buildings just up from the first government house.
Yes.
Just in relation to that and the process, I suppose, the government's response to the concerns in relation to Willow Grove and St George's Terrace would be, well, we indicated, when we went out to request design, that it would be preferable, or we would like architects to consider the possibility of including the retention of those heritage sites, and none of them were sort of meaningfully able to do so.
One did.
Well, there was one submission, yeah.
Yes, and so only one was meaningfully able to do so, and the jury determined that another design was preferable. So I suppose just in terms of the process as to how it could have been better managed, does your sort of code of ethics or best practice guides provide any suggestion or direction as to how governments might better ensure that heritage items on a site like that are in fact protected, as opposed to the process that was adopted, which was, well, this might be something that you might like to consider, but it's really actually not conditional on the submission of your design.
I'll answer briefly, but then it very much falls into Bruce's
fantastic.
territory. In terms of the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics, certainly there are guidelines. Ultimately, it comes down to the heritage legislation. You try and do any work with somewhere like Hyde Park Barracks, which has a World Heritage consideration. The limitations are exceptionally tight in terms of anything you can do, even with the curtilage of the church across the road, for example. If the legislation is tight, then obviously that places the restrictions around what can be done with a site. And that is what ICOM would point to as what is the relevant legislation, whether there are better examples internationally. So that would be something we would go out to our constituents to find. But from our perspective, the legislation is the thing that would govern something like that.
Well, in this case, it's state significant development. And what that means in New South Wales is all of the local heritage protections that otherwise would apply are overridden. It's purely discretionary. So there is no legislative protection. I think that's one of the problems.
That is one of the problems.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Mr. Dawbin?
Well,
in relation to the process that the government undertook and the extent to which that offered an opportunity to protect Willow Grove and St George's Terrace?
Well, going back to the original part of your question about whether there was any potential for the heritage items to be adaptively reused, I just make a point that many people, including ICOMOS, are encouraging another look at the alternative site, which is Cumberland Hospital, which has got dozens of heritage buildings in it, including one of the most significant colonial era buildings, the female factory. There's absolutely potential, and there's a lot of potential also to enhance the heritage values of those items if a museum is incorporated around that site. But the difference is at Cumberland Hospital, there's plenty of space.
There'd be a lovely symmetry to if we had a second powerhouse museum, if it adopted the same heritage adaptive reuse that we saw with the first powerhouse museum, and the Cumberland Hospital site is the obvious place to do it. That would be a gorgeous symmetry, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, it's completely compatible, except that I reiterate how important it is for Sydney to have a world-class science and technology museum, which we used to have at Ultimo, badly needing a lot of work to bring it up to standard again. However, that's an adaptive reuse of very appropriate buildings for that function, for that theme of industrial buildings, being the tramway, powerhouse and tram sheds and industrial buildings, which are completely appropriate to creating a display area for the huge items like the 10.5 metre high Bolton and Watt beam engine and other large items, Catalina aircraft and railway locomotives. And this is one of the issues that hasn't been really pointed out in the new design, how those items are intended to be displayed. And it's most important, in our opinion, that these are displayed together, the transport hall and the steam revolution area be maintained as entities, not be broken up. We don't see that in the new proposal. And if it was going to be shoehorned into that new development, with the size of those items and the weight of them, they'd have to be at ground level. Being conceivable, they'd be hoisted up metres above ground. And we come back to that issue of the flood-prone site. It just is completely inappropriate.
We got a commitment from the Minister this morning that the number 1 locomotive and the Catalina aircraft and the Bolton and Watt steam engines at a minimum would be retained at the Ultimo site. We don't have a commitment on the broader collection, but we did at least get that commitment this morning.
Well, I reiterate, it's a great first step, the announcement on the 4th of July, and we're hoping that all of what you're saying, those large items will remain.
Well, we were
at
given that
Ultimo.
by both the both the museum
That's
staff.
very encouraging, but there's so much more detail to be resolved that we're watching closely.
And the balance of that transport collection and the steam collection, that provides a context to those items. Is that what you're saying to us?
Yes. The cost of moving almost any of those items would be astronomical, and then the risk to damage would be very high as well. But it's just so appropriate, and the building was a Silman Award-winning architectural project when it was opened in 1988, and for good reason, because Lionel Glendenning did a wonderful job of tying those buildings together with a beautiful new gallery space, which really is not obvious which is new architecture and which is the original industrial buildings there. It's so blended together appropriately.
I'm not sure if you heard my colleague, Mr. Shoebridge, this morning was asking the Minister for assurances in relation to other elements of the powerhouse site at Ultimo, and essentially they were not forthcoming. It was consistent references back to, well, there's a business case in development, and in your opening statement you talked about the significance of the entire site, and that you couldn't really just kind of pick particular elements out, but other elements perhaps could be sold off or could be put to other uses, and the Minister was unable to provide those assurances this morning. So I just wondered if you wanted to reflect on, again, how important it was that all of the elements of the current site, the built elements of the current site, are maintained.
Well, that's one of the most important issues that has to be clarified, and we very strongly support the entire site being listed as a state heritage, on the State Heritage Register, and that it be fully preserved. And there's so much potential within that, with the Harwood building and where much of the collection is just stored out of public viewing at the moment. But the whole complex and the modern parts as well equally deserve to be part of that total listing because it works so well together.
We had the Minister this morning describing the Harwood building as a 1980s building. Do you have any observations in relation to that?
Well, the tram shed is probably the largest element there, and that is about turn of the 20th century.
1900 or so.
Around 1895
1980s.
to 1900, yes, when the tram started.
And yes,
The Queensland Government recently put the entirety of the South Bank precinct, which was built in the 1980s, mid-1980s, on their heritage listing. So I think, age, significant, there's a lot that goes into something being ascribed to the Heritage Register. So age is probably one of the credentials, but not the entirety.
the New South Wales Government just recently demolished large parts of the Darling Harbour.
You're not possibly suggesting that the Darling Harbour development go on the Heritage Register?
Yes.
I think many people would say elements of the Darling Harbour.
It was a large shopping centre by any other...
It was a large conference centre, actually.
Oh dear.
The
Plastic seats.
Well, you might want to recycle our city every 30 years. I don't, and that's probably where we differ, Trevor.
No, actually,
I don't support recycling our city every 30 years and wiping off the history. And I don't think history and heritage is based
your
on that.
attempted outrage.
But that's a matter for you, Trevor.
Tiresome.
But I will ask you if you have any questions of the witnesses. Do you have any questions?
I do.
I'd like to ask a question. Mr. Dawbin, you talked about one of the concerns that you had about the new site as being not accessible to transport. To me, I would have thought that with ferries, buses and trains coming into Parramatta, it actually is, that's one of the things that I would have thought is sort of beyond question. I just would ask you to explain that a little more.
Certainly. Ferry access, from what I remember the river, they don't go right up to that point, but
So there.
is that correct?
They don't.
They
But
don't
when
go.
it floods in May,
and it's very shallow, so there's very limited what kind of vessels could go there. But I think more importantly is that a site such as the Fleet Street Cumberland Hospital site is having the light rail, which is another contentious issue for some, quite close to the to some of the heritage buildings in the Cumberland Hospital complex. But nevertheless, that will provide a very robust people moving system to get people on and off that site.
I'm sure there are other.
Whereas at the
Central
riverfront,
Station would be an excellent site for transport access to. But no, I was just
but the
talking about
riverfront's a long way from the railway
current
station
site.
too. You know.
Sorry, say that again?
The riverfront's a long way from the railway station and from the light rail.
Yeah, but it's relatively, within the scheme of things, it's relatively close.
No, certainly. I mean, look, that's not a major issue.
Okay,
it's just
great.
one
Just
of a number.
confirm.
Yeah.
But one of the government's proposals is potentially to relocate the storage facility in the Harwood, that's at the Harwood building, out to Castle Hill and have the Castle Hill site as a more active site where people can go and visit the collection. That is a site with major transport constraints, isn't it? Are you aware of any key cultural site that works, that has those kinds of transport constraints that we see with Castle Hill?
The War Memorial is a good example. They have an outpost, very large industrial building, mainly for their aircraft. It's only a couple of years old, in Mitchell, and they've got another workshop complex across the road from it. Now, though under controlled situations, admittedly, but they are accessible to groups. That facility, and it's a wonderful facility in which they couldn't possibly put those sort of items in the War Memorial. There'd be no room for anything else.
Does that come with a transport plan? I mean, how would you make the Castle Hill site work? Is there a transport plan that you'd attach to it? If there are examples like that work?
I'm not personally familiar with the Castle Hill site. I haven't actually been there.
For an international comparison, the National Museum of Scotland have what they call an open storage program and a new facility, which is a shared facility with other national agencies in Scotland, in Granton. They run a shuttle bus from the main campus for those that want to go from Chambers Street in Edinburgh out to the storage facility. I wouldn't be able to quote how often it runs and how many days a week, but that's how they get around some of the accessibility issues. They too are a 4-campus museum with 2 of the campuses located, one's more than an hour's drive from the Central Museum.
So should that be something that the government looks at in terms of linking the Parramatta facility with the Castle Hill facility? Not just a organisational link, but perhaps also a shuttle bus or a transport link to physically link the 2 facilities?
I think there's a number of international examples which ICOM can provide in terms of comparative models for the powerhouse administration to look at when they're trying to connect them. There's a number of very successful international models with multi-campus activity.
Well, if you could provide any further detail on it, I think that would be of great assistance. Because I think we all want the multiple site concept to work. We need to make sure it sort of has a coherence to it.
No, I think any opening up of the Castle Hill warehouse would be encouraged by our group. It's a positive thing that would only enhance both Ultimo and the Parramatta sites.
I
just wanted to ask Mr. Dawbin, I think in your opening remarks you talked about your view and the view of your organisation being that the important continued use of the Ultimo site as a science and technology museum. The suggestion from the Minister seemed to be that in fact the science and technology element would perhaps be moved to Parramatta and that the site at Ultimo, whilst final plans are still very much TBC, would perhaps be more so in the sort of fashion or design type space. I wondered if correct me if I misheard or misunderstood your opening statements, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about if it is your view that the Ultimo site and its links, its history to sort of science and technology space, it is suitable to move that element out to Parramatta.
No, well, that's where we totally disagree. For the reasons we've talked about before, with the large items, breaking up the collection.
So I think the suggestion from the Minister seemed to be that those 3 large items that my colleague Mr Shoebridge identified would stay at Ultimo, but the rest of the sort of science and technology elements of the Ultimo site would move to Parramatta, and that there would be other uses at Ultimo, perhaps more so around design or fashion. Do you think that that would be suitable or smart?
No, and it doesn't just stop at those large items like the beam engine and railway locomotives. There's also a space component, which is quite large, and it would break up the collection. You know, the theme is so consistently applied arts and sciences, hence its name. And I guess there is a point where that goes across to things like fashion, but that's very peripheral, and there is a fashion display, of course, at the Powerhouse Museum. But I think it would be a very negative outcome if that started to compete with the emphasis of the site, of the museum, celebrating and showing the narrative of the development of industry and technology.
We had a slight move from the government this morning on that, where I think the Minister indicated that the present intention for the Ultimo site was to have it, I can't remember the exact words, but I think it was to have the industrial age, or it was definitely, there was an industrial, a substantial industrial element to the Ultimo site. Mr. Dawbin, what I understand from your position is that shouldn't begin and end in the steam industry. It should come all the way through.
Absolutely. Science and technology is much broader than just the steam age, of course.
If the essentially, if your proposition were to be adopted and they were to keep almost all of the sort of science and technology and industrial elements at Ultimo, with the 3 and other large items and the sort of attendant exhibition elements, putting aside concerns about the location of the Parramatta site, whether it was moved or not, what do you think would be the best use of that site in terms of the content of it, the types of things that should be displayed there and the government should be focusing on featuring at that Parramatta site?
What they should be displaying at Parramatta?
Yes.
Well, that's certainly Parramatta is entitled to have a major cultural and artistic gallery space, cultural centre. What that entails is, I guess, outside the terms of reference that we've been discussing, where we're trying to ensure that the Ultimo Museum is not impacted negatively and destroyed. And the first step in not destroying that is to keep it there, which that's, we've reached that point. But now, as the devil is in the detail, what happens next? Which the government has been very circumspect about responding to those questions so far. I'm not a museum expert, so I'm not going to make any more comment about what should be at Parramatta.
But curate the Parramatta facility for
I'm
us,
happy
fair
to
enough.
go in great detail about what should be at Ultimo, and I think we've covered that fairly detailed. And there's potential for expansion there in the old tram museum, which is now, the old tram sheds, which is currently used for workshops and conservatives area and storage. Well, there's a vast space there where that can expand and out into the courtyard and whatever.
Ms. McNair, you indicated one of the concerns about having a site that has at risk from natural hazards, whether it's fire or flood or whatever, is that it may have difficulty attracting exhibitions or the loan of items from other museums. Do you think that's a realistic concern for the Parramatta site?
Without knowing the details, what I can tell you is each institution, and not just ICOM members, this is sort of broader museum and gallery community, every institution has a facilities report. That facilities report goes through even to the amount of detail as to what type of paint you've used on the walls, so it's all designed around managing risk of collections. you would have to reveal within that facilities report if that particular location was subject to any potential issues. So in Japan, for example, obviously there's a lot of detail about earthquakes. It is then up to the loaning institution to decide through their own risk framework as to whether or not they'll accept that risk. So yes, it could potentially be an issue if the powerhouse facilities report did reflect that flooding was a possibility, and obviously that would be reflected in their insurance documentation and if they're using state government indemnity.
Yeah, I mean, so you give a fairly clear example of Japan. Are there other examples of institutions you can think of where there are those kinds of risks and it has an impact on their ability to attract, exhibitions or the loan of items?
There's a number, and without calling out specific institutions, obviously, and certainly it's something that ICOM can provide you with case studies. We can go out to our international community and ask them for some, but certainly it can fluctuate. So a number of years ago, there were issues with loans to Russia. In terms of political instability, so loans to Russia, and particularly depending on the subject matter of the content that you were sending to Russia, there was an issue there. There's also significant risk around things like immunity from seizure, so the collection of Liechtenstein ended up in limbo in the UK because there were discussions and arguments around the ownership of some of those materials in the collection. So all of these things are managed through kind of very transparent but also very well managed risk processes within the museums community, and certainly with the amount of publicity around this particular site, it wouldn't be unknown to the international museum community that this is potentially an issue. It's then up to the collections and registrarial community within the powerhouse cohort to either address those issues and to say, because there's no location that doesn't have risk. And it might be, social unrest in somewhere like Hong Kong. It could be earthquakes in somewhere like Japan. It could be bushfires at the Los Angeles County Museum, for example. But the risk mitigation strategies are there, and there is a best practice internationally established for how to communicate that. And then ultimately, it would be up to either the state to decide whether they're happy with the care of the collection in that particular location, or the loaning individual or organisation.
Well, thanks, Ms. McNair. And so it's a more than just a theoretical risk. There are examples around the world where these risks really do impact upon the ability to partner with other organisations.
Yes.
And where they're managed.
Well, absolutely.
And where they're managed.
Yeah.
But we come back to that starting point, which is, why would you design a building with that risk in the first place? The better decision would be to find a site without the risk. Is that your position?
And that's something that we would go back to our membership, but there are certainly examples around the world. You look at the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, for example, when that was first designed and planned. They receive a year's worth of rain in the space of a week. The original design leaked. And you're putting it in the middle of a desert in an area where there was no ability for that water runoff to occur, and they still built it there, but they just mitigated that risk. So again, they wanted a world-class destination museum, and that risk was mitigated, and it was still built in the same location. So I think from an ICOM perspective, it's about managing that risk and how to manage that risk through a framework. It's potentially aligning it in the international community as to where that would sit as a world-class facility. And a lot of it is facility management. So it's down to the powerhouse, the expertise within the powerhouse staff, and support of government through appropriate funding levels that can actually manage that risk if that's the site that's been chosen.
Thanks, Ms.
No, I don't have any questions.
I think we've run out of
No,
time.
we've run out of questions, and we've run out of time just about. Thank you very much for coming today. I'm advised that you have taken some questions on notice, so the committee's resolved that answers to questions taken on notice will be returned within 21 days, please, and the Secretariat will be in contact with you in relation to the questions that you've taken on notice. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.